Coming up, this is an extremely difficult video for me to put up. To those that saw the previous version of this video, I've removed the accompanying music as some have requested, and I'm adding a section regarding Trump's and others' criticism of there not having been an election held and other authoritarian actions in Ukraine. As noted in the introduction, this is an extremely difficult video for me to make. Trump has done a whole lot of good, indeed groundbreaking things since taking office. On the issue of the Ukraine war, however, he has it completely wrong on the history, on who started it, and in terms of geopolitical consequences. When I was a Member of Parliament in Australia, I had a reputation for calling it the way that I saw it, even when it disagreed with the party line of the party that I was a member of. This did not do me any good personally, but ultimately I believe that the best people to call out something wrong in a way that may cause beneficial changes in policy is a friend rather than an enemy. I know that I'm probably going to lose some YouTube friends here, and I really regret that. But hopefully most will see this as giving helpful advice and information and will take it as such. So, I will deal with this in 3 parts. A short history of Ukraine's sovereignty and political issues leading up to the Russia-Ukraine war, who is actually the aggressor, and what the potential geopolitical ramifications are. There has been criticism of Zelensky and Ukraine for not holding elections. There's also been criticism in some of the moves he's made internally, such as closing down some TV stations, etc. It was stated that the US held elections even during the Civil War, which is certainly true. Needs to be pointed out, however, that war was very different then, with only the front lines directly affected, and most of the action was in the area defined by the Confederacy, whereas now war is total, and there's a whole lot of activity that takes place behind the front lines. In terms of elections, yes, an election was held during the Civil War in the United States, but where the war was more total, as I've pointed out, Britain did not hold an election in World War II until Germany was defeated, which meant that Britain went 10 years without an election, and I don't see anyone claiming that Britain was anything but democratic. But what about Zelensky banning certain media, other parties, etc.? For that context, seeing that we've been talking about the Civil War, let's see what Lincoln did in the Civil War. He seized Northern telegraph offices. He closed hostile newspapers. He suspended habeas corpus. He imprisoned 14,000 citizens without trial, and even contemplated arresting the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, among a host of other actions. Now, I'm not suggesting that Zelensky is pure, but what I am saying is that total war often results in decisions being made that are seen as anti-democratic. First, I need to fess up where I was wrong. I thought that Russia would have been worn down to the point of defeat by the huge amount of weaponry that Ukraine was likely to get from the West, and by Russia being unable to replenish that war material quickly enough. I thought as well that sanctions would have bitten harder and sooner than they did. All in all, I listened too much to so-called experts and their over-optimistic assessments of the war. That is to say, I'm a long way from perfect. First, a brief history. I'm not going to do a Putin and go back 1,000 years as he did in his interview with Tucker Carlson. After World War II, Ukraine was one of the founding member states of the United Nations. In other words, it was seen as an independent state. Russia, which was part of the Soviet Union, indeed the major power in the Soviet Union, along with Ukraine, fully endorsed this position. So at this stage, Ukraine was not part of Russia, it was part of the Soviet Union. I guess a way of thinking about that is that Austria is not a part of Germany, but both Germany and Austria are part of the EU. Fast forward to 1954, and Crimea was made part of Ukraine by Khrushchev. In the early 1990s, the Soviet Union fell apart into their separate states, but formed a looser alignment under the Federation of States. At this time, Ukraine had a lot of nuclear weapons, and so there was a meeting held to determine how to get Ukraine to surrender those nuclear weapons. The Budapest Agreement, from which I will show and read relevant parts, was the result. I will put a link to the Budapest Agreement below. Okay, this is the English text of the Budapest Memorandum. Ukraine, the Russian Federation, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the United States of America welcome the accession of Ukraine to the Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons as a non-nuclear weapon state. Okay, let's just go to the confirmation of the following. Number one, the Russian Federation, the UK, Northern Ireland and the United States of America reaffirm their commitment with respect to the independence and sovereignty and the existing borders of Ukraine. 2. The Russian Federation, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and the United States of America reaffirm their obligation to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of Ukraine, and none of their weapons will ever be used against Ukraine except in self-defense or otherwise in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. Russian Federation, etc., agreed to refrain from economic coercion designed to subordinate to their own interest the exercise by Ukraine of the rights inherent in its sovereignty and thus to secure advantages of any kind. Reaffirm their commitment to seek action to provide assistance to Ukraine as a non-nuclear weapon state, party to the Treaty on Non-Proliferation Weapons, if Ukraine should become a victim of an act of aggression or an object of a threat of aggression in which nuclear weapons are used. The Russian Federation, etc., their commitment not to use nuclear weapons against any non-nuclear weapon state party to the Treaty of the Non-Proliferation Agreement. Ukraine, the Russian Federation, etc., will consult in the event a situation arises which raises a question concerning these commitments. As you can see, it is pretty specific, and Russia did not comply. There was a troubled history of Ukraine's democracy, with many changes of leadership and issues that I won't go into here because they are not particularly relevant to the current conflict. Suffice to say, in 2010, pro-Russian Viktor Yanukovych became president. A few years later, there was a revolt called the Maidan Revolution after November 2013, in large part due to the fact that despite promises, Yanukovych did not sign the European Union Association Agreement and instead pursued closer ties with Russia. The Maidan Revolution is worth a whole video dedicated to it. Suffice to say, significant pressure on Yanukovych escalated things and there were scores of deaths. The parliament voted to remove Yanukovych and he fled to Russia and did not contest the election, no doubt knowing he would have no chance. Petro Poroshenko became leader after that, and he had a pro-Western agenda. It was in this time frame, in fact prior to the election, that Putin invaded Crimea and fomented the Donbass crisis. Many Western supporters of Russia claimed that Poroshenko was a Western puppet. Amazingly, they make the same claim that Zelensky is a Western puppet, which is pretty strange, that it was Zelensky that defeated the so-called Western puppet Poroshenko. They claim that Maidan was a result of agitation by the West, and that the West was to blame, and some particularly blame the CIA. Even if it were the case, and it isn't, the fact is that the president who won following it, that is the Maidan Revolution, was defeated in the next election by Zelensky, who had nothing to do with Maidan. In terms of who started the war, Russia, as I stated before, invaded Crimea in 2014. So much for the Budapest Memorandum, which proved as useful as the Peace in Our Time declaration by Neville Chamberlain, and he waved around that bit of paper after the Munich meeting with Hitler. At this stage in 2014, Obama proved to be absolutely useless. And this proved to be the beginning of the actual war. It was just 8 years coming to form a full-blown war, the largest in Europe since World War II. In between 2014 and 2022, Putin fomented a crisis in the Donbass area. In the section I do on the geopolitics associated with this, I will draw significant parallels between what Hitler did and what Putin is doing. The parallels are stark, and Putin has clearly learned the lessons from 1938 to 1939 timeframe with Nazi Germany. In fomenting trouble in the Donbass, Putin was echoing Hitler when he said that he was looking after Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the region. Well, when you think about it, should the US go and invade other countries, say France, where they're English-speaking enclaves, in terms of looking after English-speaking people's interests? Obviously, it's a ridiculous argument. In 2021, Russia began to mass forces on the Ukrainian border. It was around this time, late 21, early 22, that Biden made a fatal error that almost greenlit the Russian invasion. He stated that there would be no American boots on the ground if Russia invaded Ukraine. This is an absolutely beginner error in geopolitics. The minimum should be that there is strategic ambiguity that would keep Russia guessing. This, as well as directly calling the Soviet bluff, is what Reagan was so good at. Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022 with no clear reason for doing so, but a whole host of pretexts. From Ukraine was never a real country anyway and was always part of Russia, to not wanting Ukraine to join NATO, despite the fact that Ukraine couldn't possibly have joined NATO as there were ongoing territorial disputes, which meant, in terms of Russia protecting so-called Russian speakers in Donbass, having an ongoing territorial dispute automatically precludes you from joining NATO. What is clear from the early conduct of this war was that the Russian invasion was far more broad in scope than the Russians now admit, as they clearly wanted to take Kiev, probably to install a puppet government at best or completely annex Ukraine at worst. Geopolitically, first I want to say that I wanted Russia to be removed from Ukraine entirely. Unfortunately, the war has now ground to a killing field quagmire akin to World War I, with little movement and just a meat grinder. It appears that unless the US directly participates, or a few European nations combined directly participate, there is little hope of the war ending in a manner that is fully satisfactory not only to Ukraine but indeed to either side. As such, I do think that there needs to be a negotiated settlement. I would advocate one that is at least acceptable to Ukraine, even if not the desired outcome. The fact is, Russia has to be made to pay a significant price for this, sanctions-wise, and also in terms of a real security guarantee to Ukraine, meaning no Budapest Mark II. Hopefully, Ukraine can become a member of NATO with an economy well integrated to the West and the removal of corruption. Putin has clearly demonstrated his expansionist credentials with his conquest of Georgia and the South Ossetia campaign in 2008, with Crimea in 2014, and now this war, not forgetting his fermenting trouble in the Transnistria area in Moldova. I spoke about parallels with Hitler. Apart from annexing Austria, Hitler got the German-speaking people to ferment trouble in the German-speaking Czech region called the Sudetenland prior to World War II. He then went into the Sudetenland and took it over, theoretically, to protect the rights of the German-speaking people. It was after this that Chamberlain did the appeasement bit with a peace in our time. Shortly after that, Hitler finished the job on Czechoslovakia. Then Hitler invaded Poland on the pretext of looking after the German-speaking people in the Polish corridor and the Danzig region. What many people don't know is that the Soviet Union helped Germany invade Poland by invading Poland from the other side. So part of ensuring a very strong and penalizing peace agreement with Russia, we need to ensure that Russia does not play the game in Moldova, or indeed a land bridge area that runs through the Baltic states between Russia proper and Kaliningrad. The other part here is that we need to make sure that there is a geopolitical lesson learned by China. China would be watching this situation very closely, as they are looking to Taiwan as well as the East and South China Seas. If they believe that the West is a soft touch and will fold easily, they may find the proposition of annexing Taiwan and the islands and seas in the East and South China Seas way too appealing. In summary, Trump is wrong in his assessment of who the aggressor in this Russia-Ukraine war is. He is wrong in not including the Europeans and Ukraine in a peace deal. While bilateral initial talks on what Russia's position is in terms of what they would be prepared to accept to end the war, there can and must be no insistence that Ukraine should simply accept Russia's position. Russia cannot be allowed to significantly benefit from aggressive behavior, and Trump should not be giving signals about sacrifices on Ukraine's behalf. I sincerely hope I do not lose too many YouTube friends over this, and thanks for watching.